Greetings, I'm Shad. And have you ever wondered how effective a fire sword would really be in combat? As a matter of fact, so have we here at Shadiversity. And as you can tell, we've been busy. And so, fire swords are a bit of a staple in fantasy. We see them come up now and then, or regularly enough. There are enchantments, they could be special swords, sometimes they're just chemicals added to the blade that we do see in certain films. And so, would that affect combat? Would it make a more effective sword? Would it cut better? And how would this affect combat when you're trying to fight someone with a real fire sword? We're gonna find out. So let's get started. So before we begin, I do want to explain a little bit how we achieved this and maybe some predictions as well. A lot of the credit actually goes to Nate for figuring out how to make this work.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to keep an edge on the blade so that we can still fight with it. And what I ended up doing was just drilling a few holes through a sword, which, as Tyrant will attest to, is not easy to do with a hardened steel sword. And then thread a wick through and go from there.
What people might notice, and you probably wouldn't be able to see with the fire on, is actually a wick that is threaded through the blade. Because if you think making a fire sword is as easy as just coating it in some flammable liquid,
no,
that doesn't work. I tried multiple different fuel mixtures. If you even are able to get it on fire, it lasts for maybe 2 seconds and then it's out. And so for something that can burn consistently, it needs an actual fuel source.
Yep.
And if you think, how do they do it in the movies? They most likely hide either a wick or a more regular fuel supply in the blade.
Yep.
And so it's actually something like this, but not as visible.
With a movie prop, it doesn't actually have to be a sword. Part of the testing today is we actually want our sword to still be a sword.
Yeah.
So this one here actually still has a live edge, so we can actually cut with this one. This one has a blunt edge, which we're going to use for some different different testing.
And then there are also people on the internet who have made actual fire swords, but what they are is just one giant Kevlar wick, and they use Kevlar specifically so they can burn it again and again and again. We're using cotton here; it's going to fall apart after about 3 goes, but you know, we've done what we can with the budget that we have.
It works. You've seen these things on fire, though this one, the wick is woven through and it sticks on. With this sword here, it's a heat-resistant silicone, and we have no idea if it'll work.
So this sword here is terrible.
It's a piece of junk.
It's really hard to get across on camera, like how bad this sword is.
It's a good heavy chopper.
No.
Like it's a good heavy chopper.
It is a one-handed sword.
I didn't say it was a sword.
It's about...
Yeah, it's a sword-like object. It's one of those overly built where someone thought a sword is just the thing that has the shape of the sword, and they don't understand distal taper, weight distribution, and it is insanely heavy. But it's way too thick and it's too heavy, and so it is a worthy sacrifice, because this is the other reality about actual real fire swords. They will ruin the temper on a sword.
And that's what, makes it hard.
Exactly. This is why they're mostly not practical outside of fantasy and magic. And so we're taking the liberty to pretend that, pretend you could actually have an enchanted sword, and the enchantment is basically the sword is on fire, but it will still function like a sword. That's where the analysis that we're actually aiming for here, because in reality, by ruining the temper, because it gets so hot, and these things get really hot, right? The sword will actually be considerably soft when you're actually fighting with it while it's on fire. And it'll ruin the edge. You wouldn't be able to cut well with it. Well, actually, we'll find out how well you can cut with it. You'll be able to cut some amount, but as to how well...
It's like having a permanent blacksmith that's just continuously normalizing the blade forever.
Now, something that you guys probably won't see is that even though we've found a way to actually create a fire sword, is that it doesn't last long. It actually just doesn't last long, even with this method. It's only lasting about a minute, and that's if we really pack it with fuel. Even in a practical sense, it's still not very practical.
Yeah. Pretend that you had a magical enchantment that you could just say, flame on, the sword is now on fire, and it could mostly function the same as a regular sword, and it'll still be able to keep its edge, and the temper won't get ruined. It's a magical thing. How effective would it be then? That's what we're going to test. And so the first test is, we're going to do a little bit of light sparring. Ooh, some actual fighting. There was a lot I observed from those exchanges.
I did notice quite a few things from a defensive point of view on that.
Well, from an aggressive point of view, I found that I did have to, well, I was more prompted to change my stances and style of fighting to present the sword further away from me, because that flame, you don't want to get it close to you.
No, that's hot.
And
That's
so
very hot.
there was a couple of positions that I would have preferred to have adopted that are more rest positions that I didn't want to do because of the fire. And so as a result, I was extending my guard more, which is more exhausting.
Yes, but from getting attacked with a fire blade, something I noticed that I suppose anyone who's played with swords will know is you don't fight the sword, you fight the opponent. I had so much trouble trying to keep up with where that was because my depth perception is out, and I never look at the swords anyway. I always look at my opponent, see where the shoulders are going, see where their hips are. I couldn't help but to watch the sword.
I noticed another thing is that you seem to avoid a lot of potential binding. That as soon as the sword's clashing, we
Get
were
it out of the way.
resetting,
Yeah.
because if we got in a bind where I could try and leverage the sword closer, you suddenly have flame.
Well, that's the thing. Like, so without fire, I can tell the difference between that and that. So if you're trying to reach around, when it's in flame, I don't know what you're doing. I just see a lot of flame. So all of these little nuances of it's about to be a stab, it's about to be a cut is just grunt, get it out of the way. Just hit the general direction. So if it's that way, I hit it that way. If it's that way, I hit it that way.
That's significant because one of the stronger potential advantages of a fire sword is intimidation.
Yeah.
Like it forces, that's what it seems to be, forces you and people you're fighting to fight more defensively. And for me, it prompted me to fight more aggressively. Like I was doing less withdrawn rest stances where I was presenting it forward and just pushing and pushing.
And a note too, we weren't going full throttle.
Yeah.
We were going a little slower, a little safer, and we were pulling our blows.
I don't want to set Nate on fire. And
Please
so
no. I've got lots of dangly bits that are going to catch.
I purposely was not trying to make contact. What's interesting is that you were much more defensive.
Yeah.
And if you were really wanting to, touching your opponent with your sword is a lot easier than doing a dedicated cut or a proper thrust. You can get in the bind, leverage, and just get that blade close and get to touch. And the question then is, would a fire sword, of course it would do damage. Is that a game changer though, just by being able to damage someone with a close and even just touching blade?
I feel like it is, because if you've ever been cut by a paper cut, say, like just a little scratch from a sword, we're going to give a paper cut analogy, it's, ooh, that stings. And then that's kind of about it. Yeah, it really hurts for a little while, but you could kind of ignore it, especially in a fight scenario. If you've ever burnt your fingers on a hot plate or something, so all of a sudden you get slapped upside the face, and yeah, sure, it fillets off a bit of skin or something like that, or maybe an ear, you could theoretically keep fighting. If half your face is going, ow, fire, get away, it's just...
Well, there's been a lot of sparring situations in which my blade has ended close to the opponent's face, but not enough to do a dedicated strike or to count as a strike, but if the sword is now on fire,
slap,
like that flame even licks the skin a bit, it's going to burn and hurt.
Seeing that was so hard. Like I know I already said that, but seeing where where the blade was amongst the fire, I had to ignore where you were, kind of, ignore where the sword was, and just concentrate on the mass of the fire and try to get close. Usually, I'm not really an aggressive fighter, I'm not really a defensive fighter. Most of the time I prefer counter fighters, because it gets those counter strikes, pun intended, usually make more dynamic fights. And I really like that, but to get in and get up close versus a fire blade, no, that was not fun. I want to swap. I want to swap.
Well, there's another thing that we want to test, and that's to see if a fire sword would be somewhat more effective against perhaps a shield. So, that time round, I didn't particularly feel any significant advantage.
No, I went a little more aggressively, and I did do that counter fighting. I was kind of hoping that the flame would wrap around or maybe blind me. Like, you gave a couple of good swings on this.
And I didn't see the flame kind of licking off or getting closer as a result. And if anything, it gave you a bit more confidence in your protection from the flame because you had the shield.
Yeah, and it got me a bit more like, okay, now I can counter, and I know, instead of looking to see where the blade is, because it's very hard to see, I now felt. Like, slam, I know where it is. I can counter that.
Yeah,
So,
and something else that you will have noticed is that the sword, like the flame sword, it's not setting alight the shield.
No, it's
okay,
just pure wood. Oh, well, with paint.
with paint, but
It's just wood.
But like people think, oh, wood is flammable. No. This is why fire arrows against thatch isn't necessarily good, because it needs to be in, you know, the part where you want to set on fire for a good long while. And even then, I don't think it would have set on fire such a large piece of wood with, you know, you start with kindling because there's more surface area with smaller bits of wood, and then it can catch on fire. Yeah, it's not going to happen. No. And so you're not at risk of getting set on fire. Even your clothes wouldn't really do that unless they're super flammable.
Yeah, and so I would have to be wearing like a very thin nylon or something like that to melt or have lots of, I have no idea, but it wasn't quite working.
How was your play fighting?
It was playful. Informative, but good.
You have some meat there.
I have meat here.
Well, see, we were talking about the potential damage of just getting the flame close enough to someone's skin.
This meat here is also pork.
It's pork.
Which is a good analogy.
It's analogous. It is a good substitute.
For human flesh, basically. That's just the point of that.
Yes.
So we've got pork here. Do you want to test it?
Oh, yes, I do. Because this is the thing, right? The flaming sword might not necessarily increase its cutting capacity, but it's not to say that wouldn't increase it the way it damages your opponent. It will burn the skin.
Hot.
Yeah, the sword gets very hot. So one of the reasons that you'll notice Shad has actually got different gloves on is because those are welding gloves and they can take a bit more heat. If we were going to do this for long periods of time, I'd personally probably want to go a level up from that as well. But
nobody here is using their bare hands.
No,
we're all using
not on the
gloves
flame sword.
because it's very hot. You don't want to touch it. It burns you. So will it burn this?
Let's find out. All right, so with this one, we're going to be using the sharp sword, and so I'm expecting it to dig in a little bit. Don't know how much the wick is going to get in the way, but even if the wick does get in the way, it's going to be touching and burning as a result. So
we only may get one shot with this. Yes. Genuinely one shot. Yeah. So please don't miss or anything like that.
Good luck.
Stranger things have happened.
Not with me. Look at this one, baby. Let's do it. I'm going in for another one. Look at the charring. Come in close. Come in close. Look at the charring there. Holy dooly, that one fully cut into it. You can hear it. That's way more effective than I was expecting. Like, I thought the wick might get in the way of its cutting capacity. Look how deep these slashes are.
Yeah, that didn't. That really didn't. I honestly thought that was going to fall apart myself, but
this is a blade that has a reasonable edge on it, and it's very heavy, so it's a very good chopper.
Yeah.
And it's also very hot.
Like, it's burning.
It's cooking it.
And remember, this is pork, the most analogous or best analog for human flesh. And look at this. Right, that is such a deep cut. And then the burning is just, like, a couple of things, right? One of the concerns or concepts about fire swords is that it would cauterize the wound and stop it bleeding. Nah. It's got way too much of a laceration for that to stop the bleeding. And
it'll cauterize the nerve endings well enough to make you scream and run backwards, if that hadn't already done so.
Look at the burning here, right? Like, if that was your skin, that would be an insanely painful burn. The question is it overkill? Is the burning necessary when you have a cut this deep? Look at this, you can hear the burning.
This thing is incredibly hot. If you touch this with your bed, it's basically like touching a cooking pan.
Yeah.
Thing. It is right now searing this flesh.
This is really interesting because it did not impact its cutting ability really at all. Even with this thick wick.
Not to the lethal level. Yeah. Like, it may have gone deeper again, but what's the point after a cut that deep?
If you had a magical sword, right, that was able to withstand the heat, maintain its edge and temper, and you could turn off and on at will, if you had a glove to protect, I guess, your hands, there's no real downside because it's just extra damage, extra injury, greater intimidation, and the fact that you could burn by proximity.
I don't think we need to have some sort of magic for the handle necessarily. Because all the swords we're testing with are one-handed swords,
they are,
which is like the worst for this. If we had something like, not a katana, but like a katana length where you're supposed to use two hands.
Like a long sword?
Like a long sword. I do think there's enough material and heat dispersion, not if it's lit forever with magic, but with what we're doing, I think there would be enough to handle it safely.
And you would actually be able to make the crossguard, or at least the back end of the crossguard, out of different materials, similar to maybe ceramics, that would be a little more heat resistant. Ceramics maybe not for the impact and the shattering, but you'd be able to do something so that it doesn't burn the back of your hand. But
worst case scenario, you could just make it a little bit longer and then hold your hand a little bit further away.
This is far more effective and less detrimental than I was expecting.
This is the sword with the edge. We've only got probably one more light. One more light with this. Now, that means we want to do some more cutting tests with this. So we're basically just going to have to do them like back to back, just straight, as quick as we can, because this is about to decay.
Yes.
All right, so I think we'll try in rapid succession, put on a water bottle, pool noodle, and have we got anything else?
Well, the water bottle has to be last.
Yeah, that's the last. Wow. We'll start with the pool noodle, which is a standard cutting test for swords.
So, who's hungry?
I'm not.
Hey! Well, it cut and then it didn't and then it did.
It also sort of cut and ripped. Like the first, I feel like the hotter it got, the better it performed. So this is an iron bar.
So look, out of the three of us, I'm the one who does the most cut tests here.
Yep.
This thing is terrible. It is so bad.
There is your first cut right there.
hate
Not
this.
this.
So
That is your first.
Tyrant is specifically referring to the weight and build of the sword, not the fire, addition.
The fire bit was really, really cool. But the problem is, first off, this blade profile is just not very good. It's super heavy, and then we've got the wick on the outside.
And look how thick the wick makes this thing. Look at it on profile. So that's what was happening when you started to cut into it. It was the wick hitting the pool noodle. But even with that, you were able to cut through it at certain points.
But what I noticed was when he had good edge alignment, he kind of ripped through it. But then as the blade got hotter and hotter, it started doing more damage until eventually there was, like, we can sort of see that.
Yeah, look at that.
Look at that melting as it's slicing through, and it goes through at such a weird angle that should have torn, that shouldn't have cut.
It felt as though this moved under the pressure and started to actually melt through it. And then when we get to the end, it's just basically tearing.
Like on the misfires, like we normally wouldn't get cuts, and it was just melting in and tearing through. Like that's probably about a normal cut.
So when we do a water bottle cut test, it usually you can feel what your edge alignment. You can feel how smooth it is, how sharp your blade is. With this, it felt like nothing. Really? I just felt like a baseball bat just hitting a water bottle. It cut it.
It did.
It exploded it.
It exploded it. Yeah. So it worked. It just wasn't very nice.
Alrighty, well, let's go back to the castle and share our final thoughts. In all honesty, fire swords are more effective than I was giving credit before going into this.
They're fun. They're fun.
But there's actually some legitimate things that would give you an advantage in combat, which makes them a viable type of weapon enchantment if you had the magic to just make a sword on fire.
Exactly, and even if you had a short-term combat, because a lot of battles didn't last as long as what everybody thinks they did. If you had the ability to have your frontline troops have those, that's going to be really effective. You let the fire burn in, you've got a really hot sword, it's going to do extra damage. Intimidation factor, defensively, as we saw, maybe not so much so, but aggressively.
Well, and when it comes to that extra damage, right, I was thinking about it. We got some pretty big lacerations on that pork, but it also seared the edges, and I wonder if that would make it a lot more difficult to try and tend the wound afterwards. If they wanted to try and sew that up, the skin would be burnt, and one could make the skin more fragile to close the wound, and it would be even more painful for the person getting sewed up.
What about morale? You're finding your own troops, you're smelling your own troops getting
the burnt flesh. So if we were to translate a fire sword into, say, role-playing game statistics, I think
GMs and DMs note, blades should be blackened. They should be blackened.
They would be black blades. The damage bonus would be marginal. Like when I think back to D&D, the fire bonus is like extra 1d6 damage. I actually think you would probably get extra 1 or 2 damage, right? But you would get an intimidation factor that you would want to incorporate into combat, and a type of like longer lasting wound on the opponent.
Yeah. And I would actually say a bonus to hit.
Yes, an actual attack bonus.
Yeah.
Or whoever you fight gets a negative on their attack roll.
Because it is really hard to see, like those little nuances that you get used to and just become natural muscle memory, they're out the window.
Yeah, and so the damage is more a secondary thing, where the intimidation and the advantage or disadvantage your opponent gets in combat is a much more significant thing, but it is a significant thing, so much so that I'm honestly surprised.
We also got to talk about reality a little bit here and some of the drawbacks. Now, in terms of its cool factor, it's a +10. It is wicked fun.
Yeah.
However, they don't stay alight very long. They also anneal the blade, so they ruin your temper on them. They also, one of their positive things is also kind of a negative thing. Like, this blade is still very hot. So I can hold it like this, but I cannot get near this crossguard. I can't handle the blade in any sort of way. It's kind of a lot more dangerous than just a standard weapon.
It's interesting because it is more difficult to fight with. So if you're being fully fair, it's almost like the person using it would get a -1 to -2 on their attack, but the person you're fighting would get like a -3 to 5 on their attack.
Handicaps all around for everybody.
So it's a lot of fun, and it looks wicked.
Oh yeah, that very much so. Especially nighttime battles. I feel like the darker it would get, the better it would be.
Like if you fighting in at nighttime, it's a torch. You know, like you would forego any vision penalty in combat then.
No. Because you've got a strobe light doing this in front of your face.
But you'd still be able to see it. It's just got a big flame. It would illuminate a wide area.
So, in all honesty, it was kind of like wielding a lightsaber. It really was. Like, it was just really good. I enjoyed this. In terms of functionality...
I actually see that. No. I see the... Because it's dangerous to the wielder. Yeah. It's more dangerous to your opponent. It affects the way you want to fight. You're more wary of the blade.
That is something, too, that I noticed a lot of people... So when we were doing our pre-testing, we were holding it up here on the blade, but our hand was catching a light. So now everyone is...
I was holding it down. I'm holding that thing low.
Everyone is holding it down here, which changes the way you fight. You've got more of a... I suppose, at least traditionally, you've got more of a pistol grip holding the thing.
Now, this could be remedied by having longer handles and a two-handed blade, that sort of stuff. We just only have single-handed blades for this.
Wearing the right gloves obviously protects you well enough from the blade, depending how long you want.
It does get toasty though. Your hands do get a bit sweaty under here, a bit gooey.
But wow, that was awesome.
That was
way cooler, way more effective than I thought I was giving it credit. But what do you guys think? Let us know in the comments below if you have any ideas about the benefits or detriments that a fire sword would have. Also, your reactions to the tests in this video. And of course, if you want to see additional content like this where we can invest money and time and stuff like that, your support means more now than ever before because ad revenue has gone off a cliff. And so if you're willing to donate between $1 to $5 on Player, Subscribe Star, we have channel memberships or Patreon. They're all available in the links below. It would be a tremendous help. Thank you everyone who has watched this video. We hope to see you on the next one. And until that time, farewell.
Coming soon to Shadiversity.
We are going to be testing all the different things you cut swords with.
Ugh!
Yeah, just like that.
What did you put in this?